Most people consume content about growth and never actually grow. They read the posts, they watch the videos, they collect the motivation, and then go back to the same life. The same patterns, same excuses, same version of themselves. And this isn't it. The MindForge podcast exists for people who are serious about the mental work, the discipline, the identity, the hard internal stuff that nobody talks about honestly. And this podcast exists to go even deeper. Every episode, we take what's on the page and we crack it open. The stories behind it, the science underneath it, the application you can actually use. If you're looking for hype, you're in the wrong place. If you're looking to be challenged, to think harder, to leave every episode a little more clear on who you're becoming and what it's going to take, you're exactly where you need to be. I'm Caden Floyd. This is MindForge Podcast, brought to you by Warrior X Training. Let's get to work. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the MindForge Podcast. I'm your host, Caden Floyd, and this is episode 16. Lately, I have been thinking a lot about something that I read in one of the books I'm reading, which is Go One More by Nick Bare. And he's talking about progressive overload in training. And one part of it really has stuck with me, and I've done a lot of reflecting on it. And it's not necessarily because it changed the way that I think about lifting weights, but because it changed the way that I think about life. And in fitness, the principle is pretty simple. If you want to get stronger, eventually you have to ask your body to do something it hasn't done before, right? You can't keep lifting the same weight, doing the same reps, following the same routine, and expect to keep adapting and moving forward forever. At some point, the demand has to increase. Something has to get harder. And with that said, that has made me wonder, why do I understand that so clearly in the gym, but sometimes forget it's everywhere else in our lives too? So, in the book, Nick Bare talks about the person who gets to the gym consistently. They show up, they follow the same routine, they do the exercises, they use the same weights week after week after week. There's nothing wrong with that. Consistency does matter, but most people never get far enough to be consistent in the first place. But eventually, if nothing changes, the body stops changing too. You may maintain what you've built, but you don't continue getting stronger. And that distinction matters because consistency keeps you in the game, but challenge is what's going to create the adaptation. And I think that we miss that in life sometimes because we hear the usual advice, will show up, stay disciplined, and just keep going. And that advice can be good. But what happens when you've been showing up for a long time without asking anything more of yourself? What happens when you're busy, you're responsible, you're productive, even consistent, but you're never really being challenged? You can be incredibly busy and still avoid growth. Being busy is not the same thing as being stretched. And sometimes we mistake movement for progress simply because we're tired at the end of the day. But if we keep giving ourselves only what we've already adapted to, we shouldn't be surprised when our capacity stays the same. And when you train, you create a demand. You lift something heavy, you run a little farther, you do one more rep. Your body encounters resistance, and then it responds to it, and then eventually it adapts. That's how strength and muscle mass is built. You don't get stronger because the weight got easier. You get stronger because the weight demands something from you. And I really am a firm believer that life works the exact same way. Confidence usually doesn't come from waiting until you feel confident. It comes from acting while you still feel uncertain. Discipline doesn't come from always feeling motivated. It comes from doing what needs to be done on the days that you don't feel like doing it. Resilience doesn't come from reading about adversity. It comes from living through something difficult and realizing afterward that you carried more than you thought you could. We want the adaptation, but we don't always want the stimulus that creates it. We want to be strong, but we don't necessarily want anything to make us stronger. And that's why I still believe what I said in the first episode of this podcast. The struggle is the mechanism. Not because struggle is always good, not because pain is something to chase, and not because every hard thing happens for a neat, explainable reason, but because resistance, when we face it instead of run from it, it can develop something in us that comfort never could. There are challenges that you choose. You decide to start the business. You apply for the opportunity. You have the difficult conversation. You put your work out there. You pursue the goal that might not work out. Those are intentional forms of resistance. But sometimes life puts the weight on the bar for you. You didn't choose the rejection. You didn't choose the setback. You didn't choose the loss, the uncertainty, the failure, or the season where everything suddenly feels heavier than it used to. You didn't ask to carry that. But there you are, carrying it anyway. And I think this is where the idea of struggle being the mechanism becomes more real. Because struggle isn't always something you pursue. Sometimes it's simply something you have to respond to. You may not get to decide whether resistance shows up, but you do have some say in what it produces in you. You can let it make you bitter. You can let it convince you to quit. You can spend all your energy trying to escape it. Or you can ask a different question. Not just, why is this happening to me? But what is this asking me to become? Maybe it's developing patience. Maybe it's developing humility. Maybe it's teaching you courage, discipline, perspective, or resilience. Maybe it's showing you that you're capable of carrying more than you thought. Now, that doesn't mean you have to pretend the situation is good. It doesn't mean you have to enjoy it. It just means you can choose not to let the difficulty be meaningless. Now, there is another side to this that's uncomfortable. Sometimes we're not stuck because we don't know what to do. Sometimes we're stuck because we know exactly what to do, and we know that it's going to be uncomfortable. Maybe you need to take the shot. Maybe you need to have the conversation. Maybe you need to apply, post the thing, start the business, ask for help, leave what's familiar, or just put yourself in a position where failure is actually possible. And that's scary because once you try, you can fail. But if you never put yourself in a position where you can fail, you also never put yourself in a position where you can adapt. That's the trade-off. Avoiding resistance can keep you comfortable, but it can also keep your capacity exactly where it is. And I don't think we're meant to live that way. Not because we're never good enough, but because we're capable of more. There's a difference. So here's something to think about this week. I want you to ask yourself these 4 questions, and these are things that I've been reflecting on as well. The first question is, what part of my life has become too comfortable? Second question is, what challenge have I been avoiding because I'm afraid of failing? Third question is, what is one thing I could intentionally make harder this week? The fourth question is, what resistance am I dealing with right now that I didn't choose? And if there is something heavy in your life right now, instead of immediately asking, how do I get out of this? Maybe try asking, what is this trying to develop inside me? Again, you don't have to love the situation. You don't have to call the struggle fun. And you don't have to pretend everything happens for a reason. But you can choose to see resistance differently. You can choose to believe that you are capable of adapting. Reading that section of Go One More brought me back to why I started MindForge podcast in the first place. The body adapts to the demands placed on it. And maybe life isn't all that different. Maybe the difficult season you're in isn't proof that you're moving backward. Maybe it's the weight. Maybe it's the overload. Maybe it's asking you to develop something you haven't had to develop before. And maybe the goal isn't to spend your entire life trying to make everything lighter. Maybe sometimes the goal is to become strong enough to carry more. Because when I think back to the first episode I posted, the struggle is the mechanism, I think this is really just another way of understanding the same idea. The struggle doesn't have to be something you wanted. The resistance doesn't have to be something you enjoy, and you don't have to convince yourself that everything happens for a reason, but you can choose what you do with it. You can choose whether you let the resistance stop you or shape you. You can choose whether you run from the weight or you learn how to carry it. So again, if you're in a difficult season, you're facing something uncomfortable, or standing in front of something you've been afraid to pursue, I want you to remember this. You don't always choose the weight, but you do get a say in the adaptation. And maybe that's the question worth sitting with this week. Why do I have to become, or who do I have to become to carry this? Because growth doesn't always look like feeling better. Sometimes it looks like becoming stronger. Sometimes it looks like realizing that the thing you thought was going to break you actually gave you a capacity you didn't have before. And that's the part I want you to take with you from this episode. Don't run from every difficult thing. Don't assume that every obstacle means that you're on the wrong path. And don't confuse comfort with progress. Sometimes the resistance is exactly what reveals what you were capable of this whole time. Now, with all that said, remember, stay strong, stay in the forge, and I'll see you next week. That's a wrap on today's episode. If this hit home for you, go read the companion post over on the MindForge blog at warriorxtraining.com. That's where it all starts. Every episode lives inside one of those posts, so if you want the full picture, that's where you go. Follow the show, share it with someone who needs it, and I'll see you back here next week. I'm Caden Floyd. Stay in the forge.